Hello, I'm Claire, or the Gentleman Scholar. Welcome to my office and or closet, depending on your personal feelings about apartments. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Third World and what it is and what it isn't and how it started. Come along for the ride. So for this video essay, I'm trying to figure out what third world actually means, right? Because I know when Americans at least say third world, it's like, oh, a country that has a lot of poverty, a country where people are starving. For me, I think a lot about countries where there's lots of people of color, low infrastructure, maybe corruption in the government, places like Haiti, right? But what does it mean, like, professionally? And I had those assumptions, and I thought that maybe the third world had something to do with World War II. I thought a teacher told me that at some point. That is entirely incorrect, by the way, but I'm telling you what my assumptions were coming in so that we all are on the same page, because I then went on the biggest deep dive of my life. That's not true. I've gone on bigger, but I went on a pretty big deep dive. So I'm going to start by trying to explain the history of the phrase. So the history of the phrase. The first time we see the phrase third world used is in 1952 in an article called Three Worlds, One Planet by Alfred Sauvy. In the context of this article, he's describing the big powers of the world during the Cold War era. Cold War crash course. The Cold War starts after World War II, and it goes like into the 90s. The reason it's called the Cold War is because technically the two people fighting never exchanged fire on their own land. The two people fighting are the USA and the USSR, and it's kind of an ideological war about whether capitalism or communism, but Stalin-Leninism, is the correct way to run life. The reason I say no shots were fired is because this war happened everywhere except for the two countries that were fighting it. This war is the reason that the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and all the shit in the Middle East is happening the way it's happening, because the US was like, we can't let there be communism. We must invade Korea. We must commit so many war crimes in Vietnam, and we must destabilize the Middle East to keep communism from spreading. End crash course. Cold War. That was also, it was quite editorialized, but that's like the big part for what we need to know for this, the continued thing of this. So Alfred Sauvy uses this phrase describing the Cold War. He uses it in metaphor to what was the social structure in pre-revolutionary France, which were the estates. So there were three estates in pre-revolutionary state. The first estate was the monarchy. The second estate was the clergy, so the people in religion. And the third estate was literally everyone else. And so he uses that as a metaphor to describe the state of the world. The first world is the USA and the capitalist-aligned countries. The second world is the USSR and the communist-aligned countries. And the third world is literally everyone else. In the actual essay, he says, the third world, like the third estate, is begging to make something of itself. It's important in this context that we understand that this is pre-revolutionary France. The third estate in pre-revolutionary France goes on to literally behead the first and second estate. And I don't think that metaphor is an accident, and I want us to keep that in mind. And so Alfred Sauvy's third world situation is what's called the third world theory. Keep this in mind. It gets confusing later. So we just talked about how first estate, second estate, first world, third world, unaligned is the third world, right? So then we get what's called the unaligned movement. So after the Korean War, which ended in 1953, in 1961, there's a formally established unaligned movement. It includes Yugoslavia, India, Egypt, Ghana, and Indonesia. In 1979, Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba, the communist leader of Cuba, says, "The national independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of non-aligned countries in their struggle against imperialism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, racism, and all forms of foreign aggression, occupation, domination, interference, or hegemony, as well as great power and bloc politics, is the point of the unaligned movement." So the unaligned movement is fighting for the self-determination and autonomy of these nations that don't conform to the capitalist versus communist ideals. Now we get to talk about the third world theory. We talked about the model, now we talk about the theory. This is why this is so fucking confusing, because they're one word different. The third world theory is coined in 1974 by either Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping. So Mao Zedong is the leader of China, and Deng Xiaoping is like the chancellor of China. So from what I understand, it's like how there's like England has a queen and then a prime minister. I think Mao Zedong was like the figurehead, and then Deng Xiaoping was like the political leader. Is what I think is happening. Tell me if I'm wrong. I say it was coined by either of them because if you read Western aligned, capitalist aligned sources, they'll say it was Deng Xiaoping. And if you read Chinese aligned sources, they'll tell you it was Mao Zedong. So maybe it was one, maybe it was both. I can't tell. So this new theory, though, says that there are three worlds, but they aren't broken up the way that Alfred Sauvy says they are. They're broken up by the first world being the USA and the USSR. The second world is mostly the developed countries that just kind of might be aligned with either, and the third world is everyone else that's left behind. In their theory, China is a part of this third world as well. I think that this argument has a lot of merit to it, right? Because the USA and the USSR were essentially making the rest of the world their fucking punching bag. Despite the fact that they didn't agree with each other, they were but a wretched mirror of one another in neo-imperialist bullshit ways. This theory was then, criticized by the actual, the Socialist Party and the Communist Party for being what's called socially chauvinist, which is a word I had to look up, which is essentially that it has patriotism to it instead of just being designed to destroy capitalism, right? So China thinks it's as a third world and it wants to come up, and that's socially chauvinist because it's not destroying capitalism. An interesting word that I learned. This is also interesting because, for me, it sets up this idea of a global proletariat, if you look at it from a Marxist lens, which I think carries throughout everything else. But again, the Marxists didn't like it because it was socially chauvinist. It wasn't just based in destroying capitalism. It was also based in a sense of nationalism and patriotism, for China specifically. So there are two different theories that use the phrase third world. There's the third world model, which is based in Cold War ideas. It has the USA as the first, the USSR as the second world, and everyone unaligned as the third world. And then we have the third world theory, which has the USA and the USSR as the first world, developed countries that are still under their thumb as the second world, and underdeveloped countries that are at the whim of everyone as the third world. These are some of the first modern ideas of breaking down countries in the global scheme of things, and there's been lots of outgrowth because of this. The most similar one that I've been able to find to specifically the third world theory, which was posited by Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, is what's called the Periphery System, which is based in global economic output, and it has 3 tiers: core countries, semi-periphery countries, and periphery countries. Core countries are the global powers, the bloc powers, right? USA, now Russia, China, Canada, those big economic powers. Semi-periphery countries are the developing nations that lead into those countries, right? And periphery countries are those that don't. This also aligns really well with what are called economic levels. If you've ever taken a macroeconomics class, you've probably heard about primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and quinary style economies. Primary being agricultural, secondary being just industrialized, and on and on and on. That's how semi-periphery and the periphery system breaks down, right? If you're a quaternary, tertiary, or quinary, which is a weird order to say those in, country, you're at the top. You're a core country. You're not making anything. You're trading cryptocurrency or something. If you're a secondary economy, which is an industrialized economy, you're processing raw goods, you're semi-periphery. And if you're periphery, you're a primary economy. You're creating raw goods, right? So that leaves us with our global proletariat being the periphery economies. There's a big problem here, though, and it's that periphery countries are oftentimes a one-export country. There's a reason this is bad, and it's most easily illustrated with the Irish potato famine. If your entire economy is based in one export that exports to a large country, and they process it and export it again, if there's a drought of any kind, or for some reason the country that you're exporting to doesn't want it anymore, you're fucked. Your people are going to starve and maybe move to America, as the Irish potato famine did. But that's, right? It works like a supply chain. So if the second part of the supply chain doesn't want the first part, the creators of the first part are largely left scrambling. That's a big critique of how this is happening. It also feels a lot like neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism, right? There's a country that is consuming all of the goods created by one country, and most of the time, the country creating them isn't getting a fair wage or fair price for creating those. So it just means that these bloc countries are still in control of the countries below them. Just, they don't have a standing army there.
Unless you're America, we have standing armies everywhere. It's very concerning.
But that's that. The next outgrowth of categorizing countries is this idea of less developed nations or developing countries. This is all based off of a system by Walt Whitman Rostow, not related to Walt Whitman the poet, probably just named after, in 1960. And here are the stages of development that he lays out. You have traditional society, preconditions for takeoff, the drive to maturity, and the age of mass consumption. So I'll break those down a little bit more. Traditional society is not at your potential economic output. You're just vibing, subsistence farmers, maybe horticulturalists, whatever. Preconditions for takeoff is the beginning of industrialization and some international trade. Takeoff is that economic growth, that industrialization, big economic trade. The drive to maturity is sustained growth and technological advances. You're moving away from pure industrialization and into what would be called a tertiary economy. You're not necessarily making stuff. You might now be thinking about things. And then the drive to maturity is sustained growth and tech advances. That's quaternary and quinary economies. Again, trading stocks, thinking about things that don't exist. The concept of a think tank doesn't exist in industrialized nations, right? This is how the developed nation systems work. It's very biased towards neoliberalist ideas of like capitalism and expansion and everything is the goal. And it's also very focused on like Western bureaucratic society and the way that the West industrialized, right? Because the West industrialized first. And so everyone else is now held to the yardstick of how the West industrialized, even though it's been a couple hundred years and it's not going to look exactly the same now. And this is another system that is entirely based off of economics. It's entirely based off of a capitalist goal. The capitalist goal, which is to consume, produce, sell, and have a high GDP, which is a gross domestic product, which is like the net worth of a country, essentially. The final thing that I want to talk about, which is an outgrowth of the third world system, is the idea of a fourth world. This was originally coined in 1969 by a man called Father Joseph Renczynski when he was renaming his charity. So in this idea, the fourth world is excluded subpopulations, which are like uncontacted peoples, people that live on islands that the global economic system doesn't touch. Hunter-gatherers, nomadic subsistence farmers that just, hang out and are untouched, mostly, by socioeconomic things, as well as populations within the first world. So mostly, I'll give you some examples. The Iroquois nation is what's called a stateless nation. It is an ethnic group of people that has no political entity. This goes true with all indigenous and First Nations people around the world, the Aborigines in Australia, the First Nations people in Canada, the First Nations people here in the US. This also includes people like the Bedouin tribes that live within the Middle East, but they are a nomadic tribe. They have no state. I would argue this includes the Romani people, who are another traditionally nomadic people, ethnicity that exists throughout Europe and even into the United States. And I'd say the Amish as well, right? They're an ethno-religion that lives within the United States, but has not a lot of political power over what they're doing. There was a lot of this theory is then fleshed out in a book in the 1970s that was written by George Manuel. It's a book called The Fourth World and Indian Reality, and it builds on this idea that First Nations and Indigenous Americans are a fourth world. They exist within the first world but have no power over it. And the last thing I want to talk about is this myth of American exceptionalism, right? So in every single aspect that we've talked about, the USA has been first world. And I recently saw a TikTok, I'll probably link it once I find it again, about how America is actually a second world country. Now, this was a misnomer. I looked it up. America, starting in 2017, according to what's called the Social Progress Index, is a second-tier country based on their grading card. Now, this is the first one we're going to talk about that isn't economically based. So the Social Progress Index goes based on quality of life for the citizens of the country. I'm going to tell you about their rubric a little bit. So they talk about basic human needs, which covers nutrition and basic medical care, water and sanitation, shelter and personal safety. Foundations of well-being, which talks about access to basic knowledge, access to information and communications, health and wellness, environmental quality. And finally, opportunity, which talks about personal rights, personal freedom and choice, inclusiveness, access to advanced education. So according to the Social Progress Index, the United States is ranked 24th with a score of 86.29. This is the 2021 rank. We were ranked 14th in 2017 when we first fell to the second tier, and we've continued to go down. Now, this is based on social progress, right? It's based on access to things like clean drinking water and justice and access to contraception, which the people that live within the United States right now will know that a lot of that is very contentious. And there's this idea, right? America's first world, but now we're second tier. What do we do with that? But I'd also like to argue this, and this is not well researched. So please don't roast me, or do. It's fine. The United States was only ever first world because we have this massive economic power, and we have this power over other countries because we are neo-imperialist, right? Neo-colonizers. But because we're so big, our very wealthy, our very successful regions buoy the regions that aren't as successful. A lot of us probably are aware, Flint, Michigan hasn't had clean drinking water in years. A lot of us know that rural Mississippi and rural Louisiana don't have a lot of infrastructure. And after the 2008 housing crisis, a lot of localities had to cut their budgets so much that they literally turned their roads back into gravel so that they wouldn't have to pave them. So even though I spent this whole time talking about the third world and the world as a whole, the myth of US exceptionalism and US superiority comes through all of it, in that we are always considered first world and developed, even though large swaths of our nation don't have access to things that other first world countries do. My whole point is that the third world theory and model are just theories and models of way to look at the world. They are entirely based in capitalist economics and comparing other countries to the West. If one country doesn't want to run that way, I guess that's fine, right? But I also want us to be aware of, like, when you say the third world, what are you invoking, right? A lot of us have this assumption about starving people, oftentimes people of color, the ideas of what's called the global south, right? But that wasn't what it originally was. The third world originally just wasn't communist or capitalist. But through a series of time and changing things, we now have this idea of the third world as these deeply impoverished people that the Christian evangelicals need to go help, right? But it's just one way to measure the world. You can also do what the Social Progress Index does and measure the world through access to social resources, which does have a correlation with GDP, but it doesn't have to, right? And I guess my whole point is that I want us to question the things that we've been told and question what is seen as superior. I also want us to be aware that, essentially, the way the global economy works is, if you look at it through a Marxist lens, a bourgeoisie and a proletariat. It's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know what to do about it. But if someone has any ideas, let me know. Thank you for watching. I hope that this made any sense at all. I'm sorry that it wasn't media analysis to people who watched the last video and were maybe hoping for that. I do love to do deep dives like these. So if there's any weird question you've always had, but you have a life and responsibilities, so you don't have time to deep dive about it, let me know in the comments and I'll do that for you maybe. Also, feel free to tell me why I'm wrong or argue with me in the comments or tell me about any ideas you have about what I've said. I would love that. As usual, I'm going to put links to the things that I referenced in the description. I'm going to split it up based on where they're from. So there's Wikipedia articles, there's internet articles, there's things from the Internet Archive. I'm going to tell you what's behind paywalls and what's not, and then you can read if you want to. Thanks for watching.